Ukraine is going to be operating in and around Sevastopol by the end of next summer. So, I mean, the decisive phase of this campaign is probably going to start when Ukrainian forces are in position to begin that decisive phase, the liberation of Crimea. There's obviously no free, aggressive media that's going to challenge leadership in the Kremlin about what's being done. So I have to be a little bit skeptical about reports that come out. But even with that, there are more and more reports of people openly criticizing Putin. I saw today reports of mothers of recently mobilized soldiers openly protesting, but I can't tell yet how widespread that is. And we know that for centuries, this is not about Putin, but for centuries, Russian culture is a very brutal society. So the idea that thousands of men are going to be sent forward as cannon fodder is bad luck. I mean, that's what it is. What I am trying to pay attention to is the emergence of power centers in Russia around Prigozhin, around Kadyrov, the Chechen, even General Surovikin, the new operational commander. I'm not sure he really takes his orders from the general staff. It seems almost he could have a direct line to Putin as well. So I'm trying to sort that out. Probably British intelligence has obviously a much clearer picture of that, but you don't get the impression that there is a coherent, functioning general staff where you've got people thinking strategy, operations, logistics, intelligence, all of those pieces. It's more of a little bit clumsier than that, but nonetheless, as a good Ukrainian friend of mine told me, he said the Russians need three things. They need people, they need fuel, and they need armor. And so even if the quality of those things is not real good, they still have a lot of it. There are a lot of people in the Kremlin who are extremely unhappy with how poorly, not just the Kremlin, but the talking heads around the Kremlin that are extremely unhappy with how the war has gone thus far. The withdrawal from Kherson, for example, I mean, that really has raised a lot of criticism. And so people are calling for another mobilization. Now, I would say if they're already talking about that, we're going to see another mass exodus of military-age males from Russia into Kazakhstan, Georgia, and anywhere else they can go, much like we saw back in September, where about 500,000 military-age males got out of Russia before they could be mobilized. What we're seeing so far from the performance of these recently mobilized soldiers, of course, they're untrained, poorly equipped, poorly led when they show up. But over time, I mean, if you're there, you can get better. And so Ukrainians, I think, Ukrainian armed forces are going to do everything they can to keep the pressure on Russian forces so that these recently mobilized troops don't have the chance to get better. Keep the pressure on them. If there are several 100,000 more that somehow turn up with equipment and uniforms and get to the fight, yeah, of course, that presents a challenge. But already we can see, I mean, you've seen it, all the anecdotal evidence of newly mobilized soldiers being handed equipment that's from the 1940s and 50s. So where is the stuff going to come where is the stuff going to come from for another tranche of 1, 2, 3, 500,000, however many it is? I'm sorry for the long answer, but it won't be helpful for Ukraine if several 100,000 more newly mobilized soldiers show up. But I would be skeptical that they'll actually turn up. And I'm not sure that the population, Dr. Timothy Snyder, who's an expert on the region and who I follow very closely, he said, yes, it's terrible for the Kremlin to lose in Ukraine. It's much worse to lose in Russia. And so at some point, these various power centers are going to realize that there is no positive outcome for them. Zero. There is no positive outcome for them in Ukraine. So the sooner, you don't want to be the last guy being loyal to the dictator if he's going to fall. So I think there's going to be a lot of really tough power struggles, if you will, of some sort in Russia over the next 6 months. It feels like it's already happening, but it's not burst out onto the surface. The Russians want a negotiation, because if they can do that, if they can freeze what they have, that with their occupation of Crimea and parts of the Donbass, if that's the start point for negotiation, then they've already won. Which is why I thought it was my good friend and former boss, General Milley, to even suggest that maybe now's a good time for Ukraine to think about negotiating, regardless of the context of how he said it. That's oxygen to the Kremlin, that we just got to hang in there a little bit longer, because obviously the Americans and others are getting weary of this, or it's becoming expensive, or whatever. And so this is 100% the call of President Zelensky on whether or not Ukraine is ready to negotiate. And I spoke to a Ukrainian friend the other day who said if his estimate was that if President Zelensky said, all right, tomorrow we're going to open up negotiations with the Kremlin, that there would be a riot outside his office within minutes, because Ukrainians have paid such a price already. And they can also sense that they're close to winning, that there's very little appetite, I think, for negotiating anything at this point. Not until after Russia has been compelled to leave Ukraine, including all of Crimea, which is sovereign Ukrainian territory. And let's not forget, there are about 1.5 million Ukrainian citizens, including hundreds of thousands of children, who have been kidnapped and deported from Ukraine to Russia. So how could you possibly expect Kyiv to negotiate while you've not only do Russians occupy a lot of their critical territory, including most of the seaports that would be essential for any sort of economic rebuilding for Ukraine, but also over 1 million of their people that have been kidnapped in a way that would make Stalin proud. I absolutely hope that our policy will change and that the U.S. will provide those capabilities. I mean, I don't know how much more we have to watch Ukrainian civilians getting murdered by these missiles that are slamming into apartment buildings and hospitals and maternity wards and that sort of thing. What else we have to see to realize that the Russians are going to keep doing this until they are stopped, either by running out of their own weapons or until they are literally stopped. It is the Russian strategy now, because they're losing basically on the ground and on the sea, to do everything they can to drag this war out, to protract it until the point that we would lose the will to continue supporting Kyiv. And so I think to answer the other part of your question, there's been a hesitation on the part of the White House out of concern that if certain capabilities were provided, or if we enabled Ukraine to hit targets inside Russia, legitimate sovereign Russian territory, that might lead to some kind of escalation. I think that's less of a concern now, in my view, than it was a few weeks ago, because it appears to me that the threat of Russia using a nuclear weapon has subsided significantly, because they realized that President Biden was not bluffing, that there would be catastrophic consequences if Russia used a nuclear weapon. That doesn't mean there's no risk, but I think it's subsided. And the fact that President Xi made it clear that this was unacceptable, I think that also had an impact. So whatever it was that we were worried about in terms of escalation seems to have gone away. Now there is some thinking that China has, because of the Shanghai Agreement, has some sort of agreement with Russia that if Russia itself was attacked and that we had anything to do with it, that China would be bound to help respond in some way. And so there is a huge advantage to making sure that China does not become a supplier or an active participant in any way.